Hey, old man. Did you have a gun in the war, or did you just throw stones at the enemy?
What did you just say?
A teen mocked a 92-year-old Marine. Then his grandpa walked in. The laughter cut through the quiet diner like broken glass. Hey, look at the old man's hands shaking bet he can't even hold his spoon without spilling. 17-year-old Jason sneered at the elderly veteran eating alone. He couldn't have known that the man entering behind him, his own grandfather, had served alongside that old man in Korea. Rosie's diner sat like a time capsule on the corner of Maple and Pine, its neon sign flickering against the gray October sky. Inside, red vinyl booths lined windows streaked with rain, and the scent of coffee and apple pie created an atmosphere of comfortable nostalgia. Every Tuesday at precisely 1:00 p.m., Walter Griffin, age 92, occupied the corner booth, his Marine Corps cap placed carefully on the table beside him. Today was no different except for the group of teenagers who had just claimed the largest booth, their voices drowning out the gentle jazz playing from the vintage jukebox. Walter's gnarled hands wrapped around his coffee mug, the tremor in his right more pronounced today as the cold weather aggravated the shrapnel wounds he'd carried since Chosin Reservoir. His weathered face bore the map of a long life crow's feet, from squinting against Korean winters and Pacific sun, a scar along his jaw from enemy fire, deep lines etched by both laughter and grief. At home, medals gathered dust in a drawer, a silver star, 2 Purple Hearts commendations he never displayed or discussed. After losing Margaret 3 years ago, these Tuesday lunches had become Walter's primary social outlet. Their children lived across the country, busy with their own families. The diner staff knew him. Doris always remembered his order of turkey sandwich on rye no mayo extra pickles. But conversation remained superficial. The profound loneliness of outliving not only his wife, but most of his friends, weighed on him, though his military bearing never faltered. What most patrons of Rosie's didn't know was that Walter had once commanded a platoon of Marines through some of the bloodiest fighting of the Korean War. 38 men had followed him into battle. He had carried 11 of them out. The quiet dignity with which he conducted himself now reflected the same steady leadership that had kept many of his men alive when temperatures plunged to 40 below, and they were surrounded by enemy forces 5 times their number. The teenagers' arrival disrupted the diner's peaceful atmosphere. 5 boys in varsity jackets, loud and riding the high of a football victory. Their leader, Jason Reynolds, had noticed Walter immediately, the old man's careful movements, his solitary routine, the military cap. Something about the veteran's dignified presence irritated Jason, perhaps because it contrasted so sharply with his own need for constant attention and validation. As Walter struggled slightly to cut his sandwich with his trembling hands, Jason nudged his friends. The mockery began, subtly exaggerated imitations of Walter's tremor, snickering comments just loud enough to be heard. Doris shot them a warning look from behind the counter, but they ignored her. Walter pretended not to notice, though the slight stiffening of his shoulders revealed his awareness. What no one realized was that Jason's grandfather, Robert Reynolds, a decorated Marine himself, was about to arrive for their planned lunch meeting. "Hey, Grandpa Shakes, did they even have guns back in your war, or did you just throw rocks at the enemy?" Jason called out, emboldened by his friend's laughter. The diner fell silent. Walter carefully set down his fork and knife, his expression unchanged, though something flickered in his eyes, not anger, but a profound weariness. At that precise moment, the bell above the diner door chimed. Robert Reynolds, 72, stood in the entrance, his imposing frame silhouetted against the gray light outside. He removed his rain-spattered hat, scanning the diner for his grandson. When his gaze landed on Jason, then shifted to Walter, his expression transformed from anticipation to shock, then to a cold fury. Unlike his grandson, Robert instantly recognized Walter Griffin. How could he not? Captain Griffin had been his commanding officer during the hellish retreat from Chosin Reservoir, the man who had carried Robert 3 miles through snow and enemy fire after he'd been wounded. The man who had written personal letters to the families of every Marine who didn't make it home. Robert faced a decision. He could quietly reprimand his grandson, smooth over the incident, and spare everyone the discomfort of a public confrontation. That would be the easiest path. But as he looked at Walter sitting there, absorbing the disrespect with the same quiet dignity he had shown under enemy fire, Robert knew the easy path wouldn't be the right one. This wasn't just about his grandson's behavior. This was about honor, respect, and the fading recognition of sacrifice. This was about ensuring that men like Walter Griffin weren't forgotten or dismissed as irrelevant relics by the next generation. Robert squared his shoulders and stepped forward. "Jason!" Robert's voice cut through the diner with the precision of a drill instructor. The boy's laughter died instantly, his face paling as he recognized his grandfather. "Grandpa, I was just—" "Stand up." The command was quiet, but left no room for argument. Jason slowly rose to his feet, his friends suddenly finding great interest in their menus. Robert approached Walter's table and stood at attention. "Captain Griffin, sir. Sergeant Robert Reynolds Fox Company, 1st Marines. Chosin Reservoir, sir." Walter looked up, confusion giving way to recognition. Slowly, with effort that revealed the pain in his joints, he rose to his feet. "At ease, Sergeant Reynolds. It's been a long time." The two men shook hands, a moment of silent communication passing between them that spoke of shared horrors and brotherhood that civilians could never fully comprehend. Robert turned to his grandson, who stood frozen in shock. "Jason, I want you to understand exactly who you were mocking." His voice was controlled but vibrated with intensity. "This is Captain Walter Griffin. He commanded 38 Marines in the worst battle conditions of the Korean War. When we were surrounded by Chinese forces, outnumbered 5-1 in temperatures so cold our weapons froze, Captain Griffin led us through enemy lines to safety." Robert's plan was clear, not just to correct his grandson's behavior, but to create a moment of reckoning, a bridge between generations, and perhaps most importantly, to restore the dignity that Jason had attempted to strip from a man who deserved nothing but respect. "Captain Griffin saved my life, son." Robert continued, his hand still on Walter's shoulder. "I took Chinese machine gun fire across my back and legs. Couldn't walk. The order came to leave the wounded behind. We were surrounded, running out of ammunition, in danger of being overrun." Jason's face had lost all color now. His friends stared at their table, uncomfortable witnesses to his humiliation. "Captain Griffin refused that order. He carried me on his back for 3 miles through enemy territory in 40 below weather while commanding his remaining men. 11 of us made it out because of him." Walter shook his head slightly. "We all did what needed doing, Sergeant. You would have done the same." "No, sir. Not everyone would have." Robert's gaze returned to his grandson. "Jason, I've tried to teach you about respect. Clearly, I've failed." Jason swallowed hard. "I didn't know." "That's right. You didn't know, but you assumed. You saw an old man with shaking hands and decided he was someone you could mock for entertainment. Robert's voice remained steady, but his disappointment was palpable. Those hands shake because of shrapnel wounds and frostbite suffered while saving men like me. The initial confrontation had created a painful tableau in the diner. Customers watched in uncomfortable silence. Doris hovered nearby coffee pot, forgotten in her hand. Walter himself seemed caught between embarrassment at being the center of attention and a long-buried pride at being recognized by one of his men. This was only the beginning of what Robert knew needed to be a profound lesson for his grandson, one that wouldn't be accomplished through humiliation alone, but through understanding. "Sir," Robert addressed Walter, "would you permit us to join you? I believe my grandson has something he needs to say to you." Walter hesitated, then nodded, gesturing to the empty seats at his booth. "Please." Robert sat across from Walter, leaving the space beside the captain open. "Jason, sit down." Jason moved woodenly to the table, sliding into the booth beside Walter. The proximity to the man he had just mocked made him visibly uncomfortable. His friends watched wide-eyed from their table. "I'm sorry, sir," Jason mumbled, eyes fixed on the table. "Look at him when you apologize," Robert instructed, "and mean it." Jason raised his eyes to meet Walter's. The old Marine's gaze was steady, neither condemning nor forgiving, simply waiting. "I'm sorry for what I said, sir. It was disrespectful and wrong." This time the words carried genuine remorse. Walter studied the boy for a long moment. "Apology accepted, son." His voice was rougher than it had been, emotion breaking through his composed exterior. "We all make mistakes. The measure of a man is what he does to correct them." Doris approached with fresh coffee. "On the house, Captain Griffin," she said, her usual brisk manner softened. "For you and your guests." As she poured, Robert began to share stories not of battle, but of the leadership Walter had shown, the small kindnesses he had extended to his men in the midst of hell. Jason listened, his initial shame gradually giving way to genuine interest. Word spread quickly through the small diner. An older couple at a nearby table approached the husband, extending his hand to Walter. "My brother served in Korea, 3rd Infantry Division. He didn't make it home." His voice caught. "Thank you for your service, Captain." A middle-aged woman stopped by. "My father was at Chosin. He never talked about it, but he kept a picture of his unit. I wonder if you knew him." She showed Walter a faded photograph on her phone. Walter studied it, then pointed to a young Marine. "Corporal James Harden, excellent marksman. He saved our radio operator during an ambush." His voice softened. "Good man." The woman's eyes filled with tears. "That's my dad. He died last year. I never knew that story." As word continued to spread, more patrons approached. Some were veterans themselves, others family members of those who had served. Each interaction seemed to straighten Walter's posture a bit more, to steady his hands, to bring a clarity to his eyes that had been missing before. Jason watched this transformation with growing awareness. He saw how people treated Walter with a deference that went beyond politeness, a recognition of something profound that he had completely missed. Robert noticed his grandson's attentiveness. "You're seeing it now, aren't you?" he asked quietly. "The difference between respect that's given and respect that's earned." Jason nodded, unable to articulate the shift happening within him as he witnessed the impact of Walter's service on the community around him. As the impromptu gathering continued, Walter reached into his wallet and removed a worn photograph. He placed it on the table, a group of young Marines, frost on their beards, standing against a backdrop of snow-covered mountains. "Fox Company, December 1950, he said. "This was taken 2 days before the Chinese attacked our position." Robert leaned forward, finding his younger self in the image. "I hadn't seen this in 70 years, he said, his voice thick with emotion. Walter pointed to each face, naming them. Rodriguez, Cooper, Takahashi, Williams. He remembered them all. 11 of us made it out. I've outlived 9 of those 11 now." He looked up at Robert. "Just you and me left, Sergeant." Jason studied the photograph, young men not much older than himself, their expressions serious, but their eyes still bright with youth and life. The abstract concept of veteran suddenly became concrete human. "May I?" he asked, gesturing to the photo. Walter nodded, and Jason carefully took it, examining the faces more closely. "Which one are you, sir?" Walter pointed to a tall, stern-looking young officer. There was nothing in that youthful face that suggested he would one day be an old man with trembling hands sitting alone in a diner. "And that's my grandpa?" Jason asked, finding Robert in the group. "Yes, one of the finest Marines I ever commanded." Jason looked from the photograph to his grandfather, seeing him with new eyes. "You never told me you were a hero, Grandpa." Robert shook his head. "I'm not. I just served alongside heroes like Captain Griffin." As the initial wave of visitors returned to their tables, Walter turned to Jason. "Your grandfather tells me you're considering military service after graduation." Jason shifted uncomfortably. "I was, but I'm not sure anymore. My friends think it's a waste of time when I could be getting a business degree." Robert had not known this change in his grandson's plans. His expression revealed his disappointment, but he remained silent, allowing Walter to continue. "The military isn't for everyone," Walter acknowledged, "but I wonder if you understand what it really means to serve." Jason hesitated. "Fighting for freedom, defending the country, that kind of thing, right?" Walter smiled slightly. "That's part of it. But at its heart, service is about something more fundamental. It's about being willing to put others before yourself, to stand for something larger than your own comfort or advancement." He gestured around the diner. "The respect you've witnessed today isn't for the medals or the battles. It's for the willingness to sacrifice." His eyes held Jason's. "That quality serves a person well in any path they choose." Robert watched this exchange with growing hope. His grandson was listening, truly listening perhaps, for the first time. "Captain," Robert said, "the Veterans Day ceremony is this Sunday at Memorial Park. Would you consider being our guest of honor? It might be good for Jason to attend as well." The invitation represented more than a public event. It was an opportunity for Jason to take the lessons of this unexpected encounter and translate them into a deeper understanding, to move from regret over his behavior to genuine growth. Walter considered the invitation. "I haven't attended one of those in years. Too many memories." He looked at Jason. "But perhaps this year I will." Sunday arrived with clear skies and a biting November wind. Jason had agreed somewhat reluctantly to accompany his grandfather to the Veterans Day ceremony. They were to pick up Walter at his home, a modest bungalow on the east side of town. When they arrived, the house was dark. Robert knocked, then knocked again, with growing concern. Finally, he tried the door and found it unlocked. "Captain Griffin," he called, stepping inside. "Walter." They found him in his bedroom, lying on the floor beside his bed, conscious, but clearly in distress. He was dressed in his full Marine dress, blues medals aligned perfectly on his chest, but his face was gray with pain. Fell, Walter managed to say. Dizzy, couldn't reach the phone. Robert immediately called for an ambulance while Jason knelt beside Walter, unsure what to do, but unwilling to leave the old Marine alone on the floor. The ceremony, Walter said, his voice strained. Need to be there. Sir, you need medical attention, Robert insisted. Walter's hand gripped Jason's arm with surprising strength. Promise me, the names, they need to be read. Jason looked at his grandfather confused. Robert's expression was grave. The roll call, Robert explained quietly. Walter reads the names of the men from Fox Company who didn't make it home. He's done it every Veterans Day for decades. The paramedics arrived quickly, efficiently assessing Walter's condition. Possible stroke, one said to her partner. Blood pressure's through the roof. We need to transport immediately. As they prepared to move him to the stretcher, Walter's eyes found Jason again. The list, in my jacket pocket, 27 names. His voice was growing weaker. Someone needs to read them. They can't be forgotten. Jason hesitated, then reached into the dress uniform jacket, finding a folded paper worn thin from years of handling. He opened it carefully, a handwritten list of names, each accompanied by a hometown and age. Most were only 18 or 19 years old. I'll make sure they're read, sir, Jason promised, surprising himself with the conviction in his voice. As the paramedics wheeled Walter out, Robert turned to his grandson. The ceremony starts in an hour. I should go to the hospital with Walter. What about the names? Jason asked, still holding the precious list. Robert studied his grandson for a long moment. Do you think you could do it? The Veterans Memorial Park was filled with people when Jason arrived. Families with children, elderly veterans in caps, denoting their service eras, active duty personnel in uniform. A podium had been set up before the stone monument, engraved with the names of local fallen service members. Jason approached the event organizer, a woman in her 50s with a clipboard and a harried expression. Excuse me, ma'am. I'm here on behalf of Captain Walter Griffin. He's been taken to the hospital. Her face fell. Oh, no. Is he all right? They think it might be a stroke, Jason explained. But he was very concerned about reading this list. He held up the worn paper. He made me promise the names would be read. The woman nodded gravely. The Fox Company roll call. It's a tradition. Walter's the last one who still does it. She checked her watch. It's scheduled right after the main address. But if Walter can't be here... I'd like to do it, Jason said, the words coming before he could second-guess himself. For Captain Griffin. She studied him skeptically. It's not just reading names, young man. It's a sacred responsibility. These were real people who gave their lives. I know, Jason replied, thinking of the photograph he'd seen in the diner of the young faces frozen in time. My grandfather served with them. He's with Captain Griffin at the hospital now. I promised I'd make sure they were remembered. Something in his earnest expression must have convinced her. All right. After the mayor speaks, I'll call you up. She hesitated. Do you know the protocol? Jason shook his head. You read each name followed by their hometown. After each name, you pause while the bell is rung once. At the end, you say, "Present in spirit, sir." Can you do that? The responsibility suddenly felt overwhelming. These weren't just names on a page. They were men who had fought alongside his grandfather, men who had never had the chance to grow old, to have families to sit in diners with trembling hands. I'll do it right, Jason promised, for them and for Captain Griffin, As the ceremony progressed, Jason's anxiety mounted. The mayor spoke about sacrifice and freedom, words that would have washed over Jason meaninglessly a week ago, but now carried weight as he thought of Walter and his grandfather. Finally, the organizer approached the microphone. Each year, we honor the fallen men of Fox Company 1st Marines who gave their lives at the Chosin Reservoir in December 1950. For decades, their commanding officer, Captain Walter Griffin, has read their names. Captain Griffin has been taken ill today, but the tradition will continue with the grandson of one of the survivors. She gestured to Jason, who rose on unsteady legs and approached the podium. A hush fell over the crowd as they saw not the expected elderly veteran, but a teenager in jeans and a Letterman jacket. Jason unfolded Walter's list with trembling hands. He looked out at the sea of faces, some confused, some curious, some already showing signs of disapproval at this break with tradition. He cleared his throat. My name is Jason Reynolds. My grandfather, Sergeant Robert Reynolds, served with Fox Company under Captain Walter Griffin. A week ago, I mocked Captain Griffin for his age and his trembling hands, not knowing who he was or what he had done. A murmur ran through the crowd. Jason continued, his voice growing stronger. Today, I have the honor of reading the names of men who never got to grow old, whose hands never got to tremble with age, because they gave their lives for their country and their fellow Marines. He looked down at the list, took a deep breath, and began. Private First Class Michael Abernathy, Tulsa, Oklahoma. The bell rang once clear and solemn in the autumn air. Private James Buchanan, Savannah, Georgia. Another toll of the bell. With each name, Jason grew more aware of the weight of what he was doing. These weren't just words on paper. Each name represented a life cut short, a family left to grieve potential unfulfilled. He thought of the photographed young men, not much older than himself, their expressions serious, but their eyes still bright with youth. Corporal David Hernandez, San Antonio, Texas. The bell rang. As he continued down the list, Jason noticed an elderly man in the front row, weeping silently, his wife's arm around his shoulders. A Korean War veteran himself, perhaps, or maybe a brother or friend of one of these fallen Marines. Private William Jenkins, Boise, Idaho. The bell's resonance seemed to linger longer with each toll. Jason was halfway through the list when he saw movement at the back of the gathering. An ambulance had arrived quietly, and paramedics were carefully helping someone in a wheelchair. Even from a distance, Jason recognized Walter Griffin, still in his dress blues, an IV attached to his arm. Beside him stood Robert, his hand on Walter's shoulder. Jason faltered for a moment, then continued with renewed purpose, determined to complete this sacred task with the dignity it deserved. As Jason neared the end of the list, doubt crept in. Was he worthy of this responsibility? A week ago, he had been mocking an old man for sport, laughing at hands that shook from wounds received in service. What right did he have to speak these hallowed names? Staff Sergeant Thomas Wilson, Detroit, Michigan. The bell tolled. Only 3 names remained. Walter was now positioned at the front of the crowd, his eyes fixed on Jason. The old Marine's expression was unreadable, but his presence was commanding even from a wheelchair. Jason's mouth went dry. The final names blurred before his eyes. He had promised to do this right, to honor these men properly. What if he mispronounced a name? What if his voice broke? What if the veterans in attendance saw his performance as disrespectful? He looked up from the list, his eyes finding his grandfather's. Robert gave a slight nod of encouragement. Beside him, Walter sat straight in his wheelchair, embodying the dignity of the Corps even in his weakened state. Jason took a deep breath and continued. Private First Class Robert Yates, Cheyenne, Wyoming. The bell rang for the 25th time. Corporal James Zimmerman, Portland, Maine. 26. Jason paused, realizing the final name was different from the others. It had been added in a shakier hand, dated just 5 years ago. Staff Sergeant Richard Griffin, Boston, Massachusetts. The bell tolled for the 27th and final time. A wave of understanding passed through Jason. Richard Griffin, Walter's son. He hadn't just lost his men in Korea, he had lost his own child to war as well, likely in Iraq or Afghanistan. The weight of this realization made the closing words even more significant. Jason straightened his posture, channeling the military bearing he had observed in both Walter and his grandfather. Present in spirit, sir, he called out, his voice carrying across the hushed park. The silence that followed was profound. Hundreds of people stood motionless, united in remembrance. Jason remained at the podium, uncertain what to do next, feeling both the immense responsibility of the moment and his own inadequacy to fully honor it. Then from his wheelchair, Walter Griffin raised his trembling right hand in a solemn salute. One by one, every veteran in attendance followed suit, saluting not just the names that had been read, but also the young man who had ensured they were remembered. As Jason stepped away from the podium, the event organizer resumed the ceremony. He made his way through the crowd toward Walter and his grandfather, aware of the eyes following him, some approving, others still skeptical of the teenager who had taken on such a solemn duty. An older veteran stopped him with a hand on his arm. That last name, Richard Griffin, was that the captain's son? Jason nodded. I think so. I didn't know until I read it. The veteran's expression darkened. Marine Corps like his father, killed in Fallujah. Walter never recovered from it. Stopped coming to our reunions after that. This new information made Jason even more aware of the depth of Walter's losses, not just comrades in Korea, but his own son following in his footsteps to a similar fate. When he finally reached Walter, and Robert Jason found himself unable to speak. What could he possibly say to this man who had endured so much, whom he had so carelessly disrespected just days ago? Walter solved the dilemma by extending his hand. You did well, son, he said, his voice weak but clear. They would be proud. After the ceremony concluded, a small group gathered around Walter. The paramedics had insisted he return to the hospital, but he had refused to leave until the entire ceremony was complete. Captain Griffin, you should be resting, the event organizer fretted. I've rested enough, Walter replied. Some days are worth the pain. He turned to Jason, who still stood nearby, the list of names clutched carefully in his hand. Keep it, Walter said, noticing Jason's attempt to return the paper. Someone will need to read those names when I'm gone. The implication stunned Jason. Sir, I don't deserve. It's not about deserving, Walter interrupted. It's about being willing. You showed that today. His eyes, though tired, held a clarity and purpose that transcended his physical weakness. You made a mistake at the diner, then you made a choice to correct it. That's what matters. Robert placed a hand on his grandson's shoulder, pride evident in his expression. The men we remember today never had the chance to make mistakes and learn from them. They never grew old. Their hands never trembled. Their lives ended in service to something greater than themselves. Walter nodded. The greatest honor we can give them is to live lives worthy of their sacrifice. He looked directly at Jason. To recognize that our freedom to make mistakes and to correct them was purchased at tremendous cost. The paramedics approached, indicating it was time to leave. As they prepared to help Walter back into the ambulance, he made one final request. "Jason, would you visit an old Marine in the hospital tomorrow? I have some stories I'd like to share about your grandfather, about my son, about what it means to serve in uniform or out of it." "I'll be there, sir," Jason promised without hesitation. As the ambulance departed, the crowd slowly dispersed. Jason and Robert remained standing before the stone memorial where the names of local fallen service members were engraved. Richard Griffin's name was among the most recent additions. "I never knew about Walter's son," Robert said quietly. "We lost touch after Korea. Different lives, different paths." "Why didn't you tell me more about your service?" Jason asked. "About Captain Griffin and what happened there?" Robert was silent for a moment. "Some experiences defy words, son, and some men like Walter deserve better than to be reduced to war stories." He looked at his grandson. "I wanted you to respect veterans not because of what they endured, but because of the character it took to endure it." Jason nodded, understanding dawning. "I think I get it now." A week ago, he had seen only an old man with shaking hands. Today, he had glimpsed the full measure of the man, not just his past courage, but his present dignity in the face of loss and physical decline. "I'm proud of you today," Robert said simply. Those 5 words, more than anything else that had happened, marked Jason's transformation from thoughtless teenager to young man beginning to understand the deeper meanings of respect, sacrifice, and honor. Walter spent 3 days in the hospital. The doctors confirmed he had suffered a minor stroke, but expected a full recovery with proper medication and therapy. Jason visited each day, as promised, sometimes with Robert, sometimes alone. During those visits, Walter shared stories not primarily of battle, though those came too, but of the men themselves. He spoke of Michael Abernathy's talent for drawing caricatures that had kept up morale during the darkest days. He described James Buchanan's collection of recipes he planned to use in the restaurant he would never open. He recalled David Hernandez's devotion to his younger siblings, for whom he had sent most of his military pay. The names on the list became people to Jason, individuals with dreams, talents, and futures that had been sacrificed. He learned about Walter's son Richard, as well a Marine who had followed his father's example of putting the welfare of his men above his own safety. At school, Jason's perspective shifted. When his friends asked about his absence from their weekend activities, he explained about Walter and the Veterans Day ceremony. Some were dismissive, but others listened with unexpected interest. "My uncle served in Afghanistan," one said quietly. "He doesn't talk about it much." 6 months later, Walter Griffin sat in his usual booth at Rosie's diner. His recovery had been remarkable. The tremor in his hands was still present, but less pronounced with his new medication. Across from him sat Jason, now a regular companion for these Tuesday lunches. Their unlikely friendship had transformed them both. Walter had emerged from his isolation, becoming a regular speaker at the local high school's history classes. His first-hand accounts of the Korean War brought to life what had been dry textbook pages for most students. Jason had changed too. He still played football, still enjoyed the typical activities of a high school senior, but he had developed a depth of character his friends noticed. He had started a school club that connected students with veterans in the community, creating relationships that benefited both groups. Most significantly, Jason had made his decision about his future. He would attend college on an ROTC scholarship with plans to become an officer in the Marine Corps, not out of blind patriotism or thirst for adventure, but from a genuine desire to serve something larger than himself. On a warm June evening, Walter attended Jason's high school graduation. He sat with Robert and Jason's parents, his Marine Corps cap placed carefully on his lap. After receiving his diploma, Jason made his way directly to Walter, stopping before the elderly Marine. Without a word, he rendered a perfect salute, one he had practiced for weeks under his grandfather's tutelage. Walter returned the salute with dignity, his hand steady in this moment of ceremony. "The men whose names you read would be proud," Walter said, echoing his words from the Veterans Day ceremony. "As am I." Jason lowered his hand. "Thank you, sir, for teaching me that respect isn't about age or appearance. It's about recognizing the worth in every person, especially those whose sacrifices we can never fully understand." Around them, the graduation crowd continued its celebration, unaware of the profound moment of connection between a 92-year-old Marine and the teenager who had once mocked him, a connection forged through remembrance, respect, and the recognition of what truly matters.